You are listening to the New Book of Daniel podcast. Hello, and welcome to the New Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski, and I'll be your host on this adventure for today, the 12th day of November, the year 2020. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about how the Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot, and maybe shot themselves in the foot, with their mail-in ballot scheme. And I also want to talk about how the legacy media is setting up the country for riots. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. First, I want to point out the false information being presented by social media. Specifically, Facebook today posted a little election update saying that Joe Biden remains the projected winner of the U.S. presidential election, and that election officials say that voter fraud, which is historically rare, has not affected any outcome in this election. And then they say that they have confirmed that mail-in voting was conducted in accordance with state voting rules. Well, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is going to refute that, Facebook. And I think we can then put the little grayed out flag over your post, your update, and we say, false information, Facebook. These guys are gaslighting the country, and they are setting up the country for riots. Of that, I am convinced. Whether they're doing it purposefully or not, well, that's up in the air. But I think when we look ahead, we're definitely going to be seeing riots, and the media is going to be partly to blame. Let's jump right ahead into this Democrats shooting themselves in the foot. Over on uncoverdc.com, editor-in-chief Tracy Beans has an article that came out today. Intervenors for Democrats in the Pennsylvania lawsuit prove the Trump campaign claims of fraud. And in the article, Tracy points out some of the information regarding the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And I'll read to you this complaint that was filed by the Trump campaign. On page 35 of their complaint, it says, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently affirmed that, quote, ballots that voters have filled out incompletely or incorrectly shall be set aside and declared void, and election boards are not permitted to afford these voters a notice and the opportunity to cure procedure to remedy such defects. In other words, if a ballot is sent in and it's not correct, it is void. To cure a ballot means to contact the voter and say, hey, your mail-in ballot was not filled out correctly. You need to come in and fix that. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court affirmed that that is illegal to do. Well, you've got some people in Pennsylvania trying to, defend their right to have their vote counted, have filed some affidavits and kind of shot themselves in the foot. Listen to this one right here. I am 73 years old and identify as white. I understand that my age puts me at risk of serious complication from a COVID-19 infection. I avoid contact with strangers as much as possible as a result. I chose to vote by mail this year to avoid unnecessary exposure to crowds on election day. I do not remember exactly when I received my mail-in ballots, but it was several weeks ago. I returned it right away. I asked the postal worker to timestamp it before I walked away to make sure it was sent because of how much my vote matters to me. Between Sunday and Monday, November 1st and 2nd, I received 3 calls from the Democrat Party notifying me that my ballot had been rejected. I asked why, and they told me that they didn't know. They instructed me to visit the voting center to cure it. And then she goes on to say, to cure my ballot, I showed the county employee my ID, added my information next to where it was pre-printed, and I left. I told the employee that I would not leave the building until I was certain that my vote was counted. Let's move on to another voter who says he's a 77-year-old black man and that he filled out his ballot and sent it in mid-October. But the ballot was rejected because he failed to include the secrecy envelope. And he says, I learned that this ballot was rejected because election officials called me the day before Election Day to let me know that my ballot would not count. And he goes in and then he fills out another ballot. Another one. I learned that this ballot was rejected because I received an email from election officials stating that my ballot was missing a second envelope. These people are being contacted by election officials, Democrat election officials with the state, even though the Supreme Court said that ballots that voters have filled out incompletely or incorrectly shall be set aside and declared void. And election boards are not permitted to afford these voters a notice and opportunity to cure. These voters basically shot themselves in the foot and shot the argument in the foot that Facebook is trying to sell us, that mail-in voting was conducted in accordance with state voting rules. Obviously, it wasn't. Facebook is posting false news. I'm going to encourage you to head over to uncoverdc.com and read that column by Tracy Bean's Intervenors for Democrats in Pennsylvania lawsuit, prove Trump campaign claims of fraud. Because, well, like I said, Facebook is lying to us. But you know what? The media is really setting us up for some violence. What I mean by that is they keep telling us this over and over again, that everything was done correctly, that there was no fraud. And yet we have 6 states still undecided, 5 of which are either in recounts or have pending lawsuits. So there is no certification going on. Mr. Biden is not the president-elect. Yes, the media would like to proclaim him to be, but as of the 11th, yesterday, Trump holds 232 electoral votes, and Biden has 227. So right now, Trump is ahead by 5 electoral votes, with 6 states still outstanding. The media is not reporting this. They are trying to gaslight us. They're trying to convince us that Biden is going to be the next president. They're acting like voting fraud has not occurred. They break away from the president's press conferences. They break away from the press secretary's press conferences, all to tell us that this talk of fraud is not substantiated. So now, guess what happens? Just listen to this play out. Let's say that these states where all the fraud has occurred do flip back for Trump. And that's my prediction, by the way, that they will. Maybe not all of them, but many will, because of the laws that were broken. And Trump is declared the winner. At that point, everybody who has been listening to the mainstream news is going to say Trump stole the election. They're going to want to riot. And that brings me to my next story. Mr. Chris Cuomo over at CNN, the clown news network, he's out there talking about Trump, who has fired his Defense Secretary, Marc Esper, and replaced him with Christopher Miller, who's been the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. So Cuomo saying, well, why do you think Trump is ousting Pentagon leadership and loading up with loyalists? He says, maybe it's for troop withdrawal. Maybe it's to get Russian information released. And maybe it's because he's twisted enough to try to do something way worse. Well, what could that way worse be? Well, as I just said, we're probably going to see some riots in the street when it turns out that Trump is actually the president and that Biden is not. And all of these Antifa groups and all of these Black Lives Matter groups, and even maybe some others, just staunch Democrats who are going to believe the media narrative that Trump stole the election, they're going to rise up. And we're going to see violence in the streets. And at that point, Trump will need to invoke the Insurrection Act. That means activating active military to get people in the streets so that they can defend the country. This is not without precedent. Back in 1992, the Insurrection Act was invoked to quell the Los Angeles riots. Maybe you remember 4 white police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King, who was a black man, and there was widespread rioting and looting throughout all sorts of places, and the military had to be called out to bring order. Before that, President Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act when they moved to desegregate schools, and people were pushing against that, and he had to put the 101st Airborne out there to keep people from rioting in the streets and from violence from occurring. So this is not without precedent in recent times. It was done in the previous century as well. So why fire Esper? Why fire Esper? Well, Esper, the day after the election, did an interview with the Military Times, and he indicated that he wasn't going to be following any more orders from the administration. Imagine that. Imagine being told to go do something by the President of the United States and saying, no, I'm not going to go do it. If you were working someplace and your boss told you to do something and you said no, I think it's a fair bet to say you'd probably be terminated. And if you just outright defied your boss, you'd probably be terminated. That makes sense, right? So here, Espy has publicly talked about not following orders from President Trump anymore. He's thinking that Biden's going to be the next president. He's believing the lie. So what does Trump do? Well, he brings in the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, who understands this counterterrorism crap, and he'll be able to deal with it. And they're saying, oh, he's just a yes man and Trump is dangerous, blah, 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 blah. Trump is just preparing for the riots that will inevitably come when he is named president of the United States. To not do so would be irresponsible. And Espy is blind to that. He's full of himself. He thinks he's smarter than the president. And Cuomo, well, he's just a partisan hack. He's a Marxist sympathizer and ignorant to boot. Whether it's willful ignorance or unintentional ignorance, doesn't matter. Chris Cuomo is also ignorant as to what will happen in this country once Trump is named president. And I still hold by my prediction that that is exactly what's going to happen. Trump will be president for a second term. And that's my wrap up for today. That's the news headline for the 12th of November, 2020. You've been listening to the New Book of Daniel podcast. If you want to follow my writings, you can go to uncoverdc.com. You can go to Red State. If you want to get a hold of me, send an email to newbookofdaniel@outlook.com. And you can find me on all social media platforms, simply at New Book of Daniel. It'd be Parler, MeWe, Facebook, Twitter, and even USA.life. You've been listening to the New Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski. I thank you very much for listening. I'll catch you on the next show. Until then, be blessed.